addition, we will move to the other region now. It's Latin America and Caribbean, and then we have pending 2 sites from Europe to be looked at. And now I propose to move on to Rio de Janeiro, Carioca Landscapes between the mountain and the sea, Brazil. Draft decision 36com 8b.42. ICOMOS, floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next slide, please. I'm sure I don't have to tell you where Rio de Janeiro is. Next slide, please. This is a map of the nominated property, which is in 4 sites. Next slide, please. This is a deferred nomination. It was deferred at the 27th session in 2003, and it requested the state party to undertake an appraisal of the cultural values of Rio's setting in order to inform a redefinition of the boundaries of the property so as to protect the overall backdrop of the city more effectively, and to put in place a management plan including revisions to legislative protection for the property. Next slide, please. The first nomination in 2002 included the Tijuca National Park and 3 headlands that dominate Guanabara Bay and the approach to the city from the sea. But they did not include any site adjacent to the sea. The present dossier includes these same green structural elements of the city, but it also includes park, promenades and various open spaces on the coast associated with the landscape architect Bell Marx and the Portuguese fortifications. Next slide, please. The city of Rio de Janeiro, shaped by interaction with mountains and sea in the narrow strip of alluvial plain between Guanabara Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, has developed into an exceptionally dramatic landscape that is perceived to be of great beauty by artists, architects and writers. Next slide, please. The serial nomination encompasses all the key natural structural elements that have constrained and inspired the development of the city. These stretch from the highest points of the mountains of the Tijuca National Park right down to the sea. And the boundary also includes all the best viewpoints to appreciate the way nature has been shaped to become a significant cultural part of the city. Next slide, please. This is a serial nomination of 4 sites. It's also a cultural landscape, as recommended by the committee. Next slide, please. The city is punctuated by the forested mountains that are part of the Tijuca Massif and part of the national park. This park is essentially forested and uninhabited, and it's the largest area of the nominated components. Next slide, please. The park contains historical elements representing the early history of coffee and sugar plantations carved out of the forest. It also includes a significant section of the Atlantic forest, some of which was reforested through innovative restoration efforts in the mid-19th century. The park is now considered to be one of the world's most successful examples of the reforestation of an urban park that combines ecological and recreational needs. Next slide, please. The southern part of the forest of Tijuca is littered with both natural and artificial features that share characteristics of romantic parks and gardens elsewhere, and certainly reflect the influence of European ideas. Next slide. The Carioca mountain range includes the Corcovado Peak, with its monumental statue of Christ the Redeemer installed in 1931. Next slide. Lower down the Tijuca Massif are the botanical gardens, and they're part of the national park, and these were established in 1808. Next slide. The design of the gardens is neoclassical, with straight avenues, some framed by immensely tall palm trees, which are a landmark of these gardens. Next slide, please. Near the bay, the Flamingo Park was created between 1961 and 1965 by flattening Santo Antonio Hill. It provides an extensive open space between the city and Guanabara Bay. A large team of specialist architects, engineers and botanists, including the landscape architect Bell Marx, who was in charge of the landscape design, were involved in this project. Next slide, please. Bell Marx was also responsible for the design of the promenade along Guanabara Bay. Next slide. Its distinct mosaic paving became a model landscaping solution that was copied widely elsewhere. Next slide. The Niteroi forts are included in the nomination, spreading around the bay, and exemplify the role of protection as part of the city's history. Next slide, please. It is not the city of Rio de Janeiro that is being nominated, but the landscape within which the city developed. This natural landscape has been shaped and extended over time to become an intensely valuable asset for the city. The four areas are thus part of an overall cultural landscape, but not the whole of it. The second crucial aspect is the tight interaction between the open areas of the city and its built areas, which en masse contribute to this landscape, but are excluded from the nomination. The third equally crucial aspect is the benefits that these open areas deliver to the city in terms of open-air living and a sense of place. All these factors point to the need for the nominated areas to be understood, documented, protected and managed together as facets of one landscape, and for the interface between the buildings and landscape to be a key focus of management. Next slide, please. In terms of outstanding universal value, Rio can be seen as an exceptional example of a natural landscape that has been developed over half a millennia with interactions brought about by the development of the city. Rio has given rise to an extraordinary set of public open spaces composed of gardens, parks and protected landmarks with natural and cultural significance and associations which give them unique value. Next slide, please. The extensive buffer zone is the densely populated built-up area between the sea and the mountains. There are considerable development pressures in the buffer zone. Parts of the hills of Rio have been occupied since the end of the 19th century by inhabitants of scarce resources who did not have access to registered urban lands. Many of these early settlements have now become well integrated into the geomorphology of the territory. However, after the mid-20th century, the population of Rio increased so rapidly that new unregistered settlements flowed onto less stable land and across watercourses. The most effective areas have been the promontories of Tijuca and other hills located in the buffer zone. ICOMOS still considers that more adequate details need to be provided for the protection and management of the buffer zone in controlling development pressures in these areas. The sea around the city of Rio, mainly Guanabara Bay and the ports, are acknowledged to be affected by water pollution due to discharges from various areas, and ICOMOS considers that more details are needed on water pollution mitigation measures. Next slide, please. This enormous nomination raises the issue as to what level of detail is appropriate for this vast urban landscape. ICOMOS considers that although the cultural landscape is drawn on a large canvas, its management does need to respect the smaller details of the component parts, and to this end, detailed records and inventories are necessary to underpin conservation and adaptive management. There is a need to appreciate the long-distance views, but also the details within the component parts, such as the bell marks landscapes. More fundamentally, however, is the need to manage this overall landscape as one entity. And currently, there is no overarching management structure in place, and different agencies manage different parts. Some have plans and others don't. And as already mentioned, there are no precise details for some areas of the buffer zone. Next slide, please. Next slide. So ICOMOS considers that integrity, authenticity, the comparative analysis have been justified, as have criteria 5 and 6. We consider that Rio can be said to satisfy criterion 5 as an outstanding example of interaction with the environment, and criterion 6 as for the way the dramatic landscape quality has inspired many forms of art, literature, and music. But as already mentioned, we consider that more details on the management of the buffer zone and the need for coordinated management of the series, which is a requirement of the operational guidelines, do need to be put in place. Next slide, please. In conclusion, ICOMOS recommends that this nomination be referred back to the state party in order to allow it to address these issues of the overall management framework, completing the management plan, providing details on the buffer zone, putting in place more detailed inventories, and defining monitoring indicators, as well as providing more details on plans to address water pollution. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, floor is open. So, Colombia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. It is a great honor for us to present this, not just because it's a nomination which has been conscientiously worked on since 2003 when it was referred, but also it would be an achievement for the whole of our region. It's a nomination from our region. We think the OUV has been identified and justified in criteria 5 and 6. And that's why we are tabling an amendment for inscription under those two criteria. And I'd like to give the floor to my expert who wishes to put some questions to the state party. Yes, thank you. As is said in the nomination, this is a nomination for a fascination and unique city. It's a very imaginative, very unique nomination which could serve as a paradigm for future nominations for inscription on the World Heritage List. We think that it does cover the main attributes of OUV and that necessary protective measures for the property have been taken. We need to have proper protection in the buffer area, because that is not, if that's not properly controlled, it could endanger the property.